I think so much of it has to do with changing our approach to great sex and understanding what great sex is made up of. There are so many different factors that play into one's desire for sex. That can add kind of a level of excitement, I think, to relationships that, the answer to maintaining sex for the long haul is, do you feel like life has gotten too predictable and monotonous and maybe you need to shake things up? Then,
What's a naughty little thought you've had around sex that you shouldn't normally say?
oh gosh, that's such a good question.
Okay, on the show today, we're very lucky. Emily Jamea, she is the sex doctor. She's just written this awesome book, Anatomy of Desire, which has a nice sort of embodied kind of element to sexual connection. Um, Strong background in therapy, a bit of academia. It's been on all kinds of American media, like was it the Oprah book, Oprah magazine, and all CNN and all kinds of things. I've seen her on Houston TV. So yeah, sexpert. Emily, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Let's go straight in, no foreplay. How can people improve their sex lives? Let's go straight into the topic.
You know, I think so much of it has to do with changing our approach to great sex and understanding what great sex is made up of, which is what, my new book is about. People have to remember that you're not going to want to have sex if the sex is not worth wanting. So we have to look at how we can create better quality sex. And I think the way historically people have thought about that is about incorporating all kinds of wild tips and tricks and, having better orgasms, this and that. And sure, those things are fine. But when I started paying closer attention to the language my clients were using to describe the sex they wanted, words like effortless and I want to be lost in the moment and I want the world around me to disappear, I realized that they weren't talking so much about the tips and tricks type stuff. I mean, you can open any magazine to find that, and they had been there, done that. It wasn't working. And I realized that the language they were using was flow state language. So, for people listening who don't know what a flow state is, a flow state is when we are engaged in an activity in which we experience that loss of space and time, complete absorption, a sense of merger with whatever we're doing. And most people can think of something in their life that puts them in that state. Usually it's, something artistic or athletic, and I'm like, okay, well, if that's what people want to experience, that makes a lot of sense to me. I turned to the academic literature to see what I could find, though, and came up blank. There was nothing that looked at the relationship between flow and great sex. So I initiated a research study and published my findings, and that sort of set the ball rolling for what ultimately turned into the book.
The ball's rolling, surely. So it's interesting. We've had various flow state experts
Mhm.
on the show. And when I just talk to people who aren't into sort of mystical practice or something like that, it does seem like sex is maybe the most common access point to flow
Yeah.
states, that sort of disappearance, timeless moment, all union. I certainly had those experiences myself, even from quite sort of, even when I was quite skillless and teenage and, kind of
Right.
clumsily fumbling around, I still had those kind of wow kind of experiences of flow.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised there's not more written on that.
As was I. I mean, I was shocked. I found one paper that looked at a very small sample of people who practice BDSM, which that makes sense. A lot of people in that, kind of sexual subset will describe sex feeling very transcendent. But there was nothing out there that had looked at the general population. And, a lot of my clients would say things like, well, I want sex to feel like it does in the honeymoon stage. And I would have to remind them that that's a very temporary neurochemical high. Or I want sex that feels like it looks like it does in the movies. And I would have to remind them that those are paid actors following a script. And, but I knew what they meant. They wanted that certain je ne sais quoi. They wanted that sense of effortlessness. And selfishly, at the time that I was formulating this idea, I was engaged. And I was like, I'll be damned if I settle for good enough sex for the long haul. Because that phrase, good enough sex, that's literally the term that is used in a lot of research. And I'm like, well, I don't want to settle for that. But you're so right. I think that when we're looking at things that have the potential to put us into a flow state, Sex is something that the majority of adults do. And we know that people who have something that puts them into a flow state feel their lives are more meaningful. They see that as the pinnacle for their enjoyment. And so I'm like, this is accessible to so many people. And not just for the young and able-bodied. When I, started this research, I collected a lot of quantitative data initially, but then I followed up with these long interviews with my research participants who had the highest scores on the measure to find out what specifically they were doing to get into a flow state. And I talked to people who had chronic pain issues. I talked to people who were over the age of 75. I talked to people who had overcome cancer. I mean, you name it. So I really believe that with the right mindset and tools, this is something that's attainable to just about anyone.
Nice. And your book, you say the five secrets to create connection and cultivate passion. And I think it's chapter one is all about embodiment, as far as I can tell, talking about
That's
sensuality.
right.
So that's kind of
Yeah.
nice to open up.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that's where
not just
I
tips and
quote
tips.
you. Yep, exactly, exactly. I think that, I was just talking about this yesterday. Mindfulness is such a buzzword, and that's an important starting point. But mindfulness is a very active process. And I don't think that the majority of people want to be actively engaged in this mindfulness process necessarily during sex. Because if you think about it, when someone's practicing mindfulness as a step toward embodiment, they are maybe noticing an intrusive thought, trying in that moment to react with non judgment, letting the thought pass, redirecting their attention to their body. It's kind of like a 3 or 4 step process. A lot of my research participants didn't talk about that at all. They talked about feeling so absorbed in their body that the mind completely shut down and the body almost seemed to have a mind of its own and seemed to do what it wanted to do, whether or not they were consciously making the decision. Like, someone would say something like, well, my hand went there because that's where my hand wanted to go. And so I think that is where we can take things a step further, and where embodiment really came into play and is how I discovered you.
Well, nice to meet you. And people want mindless sex, isn't it? I used to have a quip years ago that authenticity or embodiment is like wild sex. If you think you're having it, you're not. It's maybe we should get t-shirts for the embodiment people, we do it in our
I
bodies or
love
something
that.
like that. But
Yeah.
we'll say a little bit more about the role of sensuality. We're in this cognitive
Mhm.
world where everyone's on their phones and up in their heads. And then I notice if I spend all day in like business planning and then I go to meet my girlfriend and it's like blah, 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 this is going
Yeah.
on and I'm just not the sensual, alive,
No.
erotic creature I know I can be because I've spent all day just in my head and I'm stuck in that mode a little bit. So
Yeah.
it gets in the way, right?
Precisely, especially at this day and age. I noticed that so many of my clients would complain of being unable to quiet their mind. I mean, if I had $1 for every client who used that phrase, I think I would be rich. Women in particular, because women are tend to be more responsible for the mental load, the remembering, the managing of the household. And so there's this like constant never-ending to-do list. Um, and I think we overcommit ourselves more than we ever have historically. And on top of that, thanks to our smartphones, we're multitasking all of the time. I mean, when was the last time, you worked out without simultaneously listening to a podcast or went for a walk without also calling a friend? It's like we're pushing so much information into the brain all the time. It's no wonder we can't quiet it down. When I noticed that this was such a problem, I called one of my first ever sex therapy supervisors who I worked with when I had just entered the field back in like 2008, 9. And I called her specifically because at the time she was supervising, she had retired from her work as a sex therapist. So she was primarily working in the 80s and 90s before smartphones completely took over our lives. And I told her, hey, do you remember, or I asked her rather, do you remember your clients complaining about this inability to quiet their mind? And she took a few days to get back to me. And she said, we had people who were our erection watchers or our orgasm watchers or people who were maybe concerned about body image issues. But she said, the way you're describing this never ending to do list and inability to quiet the mind, she said, I don't remember that.
Mm,
you
mm.
know, and I think most people, especially people over the age of 35, can think back to a time when life was simpler, you
Yeah, I
know.
was joking to someone that I remember having the time to make mixtapes for my friends, and just
Yeah.
the sort of the idea
Exactly.
of doing, or you know, it is possible to go into the gym without a mobile phone. That is totally possible. And sometimes you
Right.
see the very dedicated people, they have notebooks rather than gyms to kind of write
Yeah.
their kind of workouts on
Yeah.
these days. But what as a sex therapist, what's coming through the door these days? Is it, you know, erectile dysfunction? Is it porn addiction? Like what's the trend right now?
I see a little bit of everything, but by and large, the most common yet complex issue is issues around desire. It's the wanting sex, it's the interest in sex. And, what makes it complex is because there are so many different factors that play into one's desire for sex. There are individual issues, there are interpersonal relationship issues, and then there are environmental issues too. And, I would go so far as to say that, again, thanks to our smartphones and technology, we kind of have this dopamine addiction that sex can't really hold a candle to these days. And that's very concerning to me. I mean, I can think back to, when I was a young adolescent, just the rush and the exhilaration I felt, wondering if the guy I was at the movies with was going to reach over and hold my hand, and probably the flood of dopamine I got when that happened. And now you've got these kids growing up with such a higher dose of dopamine constantly because of, social media and how many likes we get, that I just don't think this more fundamental stuff can compete. And so I feel very concerned for the younger generations who are growing up with this stuff.
Mm, mm. And in a way, sort of all of life is less sexy just in its busyness and its cognitiveness and our disconnection from nature and our exhaustion. I mean, you know, who feels sexy when they're exhausted? Who feels sexy when they're stressed? You know, this is just not,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
just not typical in that way. I think
Yeah.
the most common thing I hear, and you know, Esha Perel kind of talks about this a lot, is and in your book, this is the opening story is a couple who say, like, look, we've been together for a while. We love each other. We get on pretty well. We're not abusive or anything like that. But we just don't fancy each other so much anymore.
Yeah.
And is that, you know, past generations have maybe said, you know, things fade in time. That's just kind of how it is. And it seems like now people want to have great sex forever. You know, is that realistic? Let's speak to all those couples out there who've been going out with someone for a while. Maybe they're married, maybe they're long-term relationship, and it's just sort of faded into sort of comfortable sitting on the couch watching Netflix together.
Here's the thing. I don't think it's faded. I think it's that we've stopped being intentional about it. That's why the word cultivate is in the title of the book. Anything worth doing, right? Anything that is pleasurable or has the potential for enjoyment takes a little bit of elbow grease, not a ton. But I think that a lot of couples get very complacent. And when people say, "Oh, I want sex like I had in the honeymoon stage," what they don't realize is there was a lot of effort that went into creating really great sex at that time in the relationship. And so I don't think that it's necessarily faded. I think it's there. We just stop feeding the flames. And
Yeah.
that's where, a bit of effort and attention can go a long way.
Yeah, pretty dress and a little bit of time on a date. I mean, you make the nice point that people say, "Oh, I don't like to schedule sex," but you know, in the early days of a relationship, when you're like, "Hey, I'll pick you up at 7 and we'll go for a meal," and she shaved her legs, and
Ah,
I
yes.
might have even had a shower.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
crazy, and we're preparing ourselves for the end of the night, and we
Yeah,
both know that's the case, and there's that kind of build up. So it wasn't like we didn't schedule it or plan it or make effort for it at the beginning. It was just that we were motivated to, like, we're because there was the uncertainty of will I get any, you know. Whereas like after a while, it's kind of like, yeah, this person's slept with me 1,000 times. They're probably going to sleep with me 1,001 times, and kind of makes people
sure.
lazy, doesn't it?
It does. But here's again where a bit of shift in mindset and
Mm,
reframe comes into play. And maybe I'm alone in this, I don't know. I think there is something so much more romantic and meaningful when I think about my partner continuously taking an active approach in wanting me versus this very passive approach that happens in the honeymoon stage. And you say like you don't know if sex is going to happen at the end of the night. Everyone knows sex is going to happen at the end of the night. I mean, we're doing all these things to set ourselves up to, and in a long-term relationship, there's no guarantee either. Yes, maybe you sleep in the same bed every night, but there is certainly no guarantee. But I think that when love transforms from this kind of passive process to an active process, and rather than relying on desire to happen as a byproduct of this neurochemical high, and instead creating it for ourselves, to me, that's a lot more meaningful. And here's something important to keep in mind too. The neurochemical cocktail we get when we are in a flow state so far supersedes that we get when we are in the honeymoon stage. So in the honeymoon stage, yes, you get a flood of dopamine, you get that norepinephrine, which kind of charges you up. If you're having sex and orgasms, you get that oxytocin, but serotonin drops. That's why people get so obsessive and kind of anxious in the early days, because we have a dip in serotonin, almost like someone who has obsessive compulsive disorder. That's why you lay awake at night, thinking about this new partner you have. And on the one hand, it can be a little bit exciting, but it's also stressful. When we're in a flow state, we get the dopamine, we get the norepinephrine. We also get epinephrine, which is kind of an analgesic, so it can help us forget the pain we're in. We get anandamide, which, really narrows focus and again helps the body kind of charge up. But serotonin levels actually increase. So you get a lot more. And of course, you get the oxytocin, assuming that the sex is good. So you get a lot more out of sex in a flow state than you do sex in the honeymoon stage.
Yeah, makes total sense. I mean, there's nothing
Yeah.
more addictive. Snowboarders will get up at 5 a.m. and, walk across a cold Man and Peace to get their kind of
Yeah,
flow state. Like people love that. It's really
exactly.
now in the book, rather than sort of tricks and tips, it's not kind of like how to, give head like a champion or something. It's this
Right.
things like curiosity, adaptability, vulnerability, attunement. This is the kind of stuff you're talking about. So,
Mhm.
yeah, maybe you could break down one or two of those.
Yeah, sure. So, yes, this is more holistic. The whole theme here is about how to cultivate sex that stands the test of time. And yeah, knowing how to pleasure your partner from a technique standpoint is great. And I'm not saying that's an unimportant piece of the puzzle, but I take a bit more of a holistic approach. And these were the themes that emerged when I was interviewing my clients, or my research participants, rather. So, sensuality, we've kind of talked about. That's really a focus on the body. Curiosity is about opening the mind. I don't think a lot of people have spent much time challenging or even considering some of the beliefs they hold about sex and relationships, that have maybe been inculcated due to the environment they grew up in, their family of origin, culture, society. We kind of take for granted, I think, a lot of the values that we hold around sex and relationships, rather than taking a step back and really considering what is going to fit and help us understand our most authentic sexual self. So one of the first things I do is encourage people to re-examine their sexual values, see, what is the relationship between sex and love for you? What ideas do you hold about masculinity as it relates to sex, or femininity as it relates to sex? A lot of people just don't spend much time thinking about those things. And then I work with people on their mindset around sex. So we talked about, probably a lot of your listeners are familiar with growth versus fixed mindset, Carol Dweck's work. There's research now looking at people who hold sexual growth beliefs versus sexual destiny beliefs. And this sort of feeds into adaptability. What I tell people is that, the sex you have in the early days of the relationship is going to be different from that which you have, after the honeymoon period, or when you're trying to conceive, or when you've got young kids at home. People who hold sexual growth beliefs navigate some of those challenges in a way that, people who hold sexual fixed beliefs, or destiny beliefs rather, kind of assume, okay, well, if I can't have sex the way I did, 2 years ago, then I may as well not have it. Right. Mark, I think you might be muted.
Sorry, I muted myself.
Oh,
I've
okay.
got a horrible cold today, so I
Oh,
muted myself.
I'm getting over one myself.
I caught it off a beautiful Italian woman.
At
I
least,
regret
at least
nothing.
you have a good story.
It's my girlfriend. So yeah, the idea of saying, well, this is just how I am, and there's nothing I can do about it, kind of, no locus of control, the fixed mindset.
Yeah,
If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. And
right.
there's a lot of sort of magical thinking around this, isn't there? Like kind of if we were compatible, then we'd just be able to have great sex straight out the bag. Like people don't hold
Right.
those kind of beliefs, or grown-ups don't hold those beliefs around many other topics. Yet around
Oh,
romance and sex, sort of everyone reverts to a sort of much more primitive stage of psychological development somehow.
so true. I think a lot, like one of my clients said that their husband has very much a set it and forget it mentality. It's like the way it was in the beginning, and now I don't have to think about it anymore. But the fact is, and I write about this in the curiosity section, relationships are living, breathing organisms. Individuals are constantly evolving. Our preferences may change. Our thoughts may evolve that from thinking one way of something at one point in life versus another way 10, 15 years down the line, but we stop asking those questions. One of my colleagues says it's not enough to just be curious, you have to be genuinely interested. So many people don't realize they're asking very close-ended questions when their partners come home from work at the end of the day, like, did you have a good day today versus what was the most challenging thing that happened at the office today? Like that invites a conversation. That invites you to maybe get to know a side of your partner that you wouldn't have had you asked a more narrow, close-ended question. So we constantly have to, I think, question our values, question our beliefs, see if they've changed or if they haven't, and really open the mind. And this is where flow state comes into play again. We've got something called the challenge skills ratio, right? Because curiosity is also, to an extent, going to be about trying new things. But I think when we change the way we understand and understand the psychology of sexual novelty, that might open up a lot of people who may otherwise feel hesitant. So with the challenge skills ratio, you've got challenge on the y-axis, skills on the x-axis. If the challenge of what you're doing is too far above your skill set, you're going to feel anxious, scared, inhibited. If the challenge of what you're doing is too far below your skill set, you'll feel bored. And this is where a lot of people get stuck because they have sex in one way the whole time that they're with their partner. And of course, they feel bored after a while. What people need to know, though, is that to get into a flow state, the challenge only has to be about 4% greater than your skills. So this doesn't mean you have to jump from vanilla sex to like 50 Shades of Grey style sex in order to mix things up and get into the zone. Sometimes it's about making really subtle shifts that is plenty to help us refocus and regain interest in the act.
Talked about 50 Shades of Grey. So kink has become far more acceptable. I remember sort of, it was a while back, but looking at sort of women reading their porn on the train in public and thinking, okay, times have changed. And
Yeah.
the younger generation, in my experience, I've coached a few people who are sort of, 18, 19, and they're very open, very sort of sex positive. I was sort of raised that way actually, but was a bit ahead of its time.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit unusual that I was raised that way. My mum would give me condoms and say, "Have a nice time," and I'd just be terribly embarrassed, because that would be.
Sure.
But it seems like there's a huge sex positivity now, much better consent culture. Kink has really taken off in a way which I have mixed feelings about because some of it it's just like, well, whatever you want to do to have fun. But sometimes I kind of feel like, yeah, it seems like people needing more extreme stimuli to get off, maybe as a result of porn, maybe as a result of other factors. And then as a background to that, gender just generally is very much more complex now in culture.
Mm-hmm.
Even just in the last 10 years, that we're in a sort of depolarized, often kind of gender neutral background. We live in the time of they thems. And I often feel like culture's very they them generally at the moment, right? Like there isn't a sort
Yeah.
of polarity in the culture. So yeah, any thoughts on any of that?
A lot of thoughts on that. On the one hand, like you, I have mixed feelings about it. I think it's great that people hold more expansive views on sexuality, are less judgmental. The internet has opened up a lot in terms of people who may have held a fetish in the past and thought that there was something abnormal with them. Now they can find a website dedicated to it. So that's great. My concern, though, is for, again, younger generations. There was actually a report that came out not too long ago in partnership with the Kinsey Institute that found that despite, Gen Zers holding these really open, expansive views on sexuality, you know what they were fantasizing about? Romance and monogamy.
Wow, wow.
Right? So, older generations who maybe grew up with that stuff are having more kinky, it's more like your mom, or I mean people maybe my age who were so excited by 50 Shades of Grey because we weren't raised, at least I don't know how old you are. I certainly wasn't raised on this more extreme stuff, that got really excited by that. But younger kids who have internet porn at their fingertips and from age 11, 12 are being exposed to this extreme stuff and saying, yeah, I'm sex positive and pro kink and all of this stuff, like that's great, but many of them have never even had a serious relationship
Yeah,
at
yeah.
all
And I
you
wonder if the
know
culture swung. I think we kind of my generation and older we kind of understood what too conservative meant. What too conservative meant was being a bit uptight, repressing things, and then, being
Sure.
found dead with an orange in your mouth in a gimp suit later on. That's what too conservative meant. But I don't
Yeah.
think we've really got to what does too liberal mean sexually, right? Like, I mean, is it just that everything's sport and it's all fun if it's, I mean, should sex be more than just fun? I think I treated sex very casually when I was younger, and now
Mm,
as I've got a bit older, I've kind of lent more towards that. No, there's a sort of making of love, and there's I think
yeah.
men become more like women as they get older in this sense. We realize that the emotional connection part is really important, and casual sex is probably just a terrible idea for most people most of the time, not everyone all
Yeah.
the time. And I wonder if there's like when what is too liberal sexually, if we know what too conservative is.
Yes, I think it's, if I had to whittle down my definition or my answer to that question, it would be when there is a long-term disconnect of emotional attachment from sex. I think that there is a time and place for casual sex, and I am not against casual sex necessarily, but there was interesting data that came out after the pandemic. There was kind of a swing back in polls they ran across dating apps where people suddenly were like, maybe I'm not so interested in casual sex, because they realized it would have been nice to have a partner maybe sharing a roof with them when we were under lockdown. And so I don't think a lot of people realized that until they were given, until they had the opportunity, or missed the opportunity rather, to cohabitate with someone who they had a meaningful relationship. I think when we try to eliminate attachment and emotion and love from sex, we kind of cut off from something that, in my opinion, is very profoundly human. When sex becomes just a crazy juxtaposition of body parts, and we don't tap into that emotional element, which, if we're going through the secrets, that's what the entire vulnerability chapter is about. It's about how to maintain that emotional connection. I have had clients come in saying they want to spice things up, and what kind of kinky things should they try, and I'm like, ooh, have you ever tried to maintain eye contact the
Yes,
entire
yes.
time that you have
I
sex? And they're like, what? Oh my God, I would never do that.
I had a lover
Like
ask
it's,
me if I did tantra when I made eye contact during sex. She said, "Oh, I
oh
I
God.
really liked that you made eye contact during sex, but it was kind of intense. Are you a tantrika?" And I was like, "No, I'm
Yeah.
I'm, I'm just connecting as a human. Has no one ever done that before?"
I mean, that epitomizes exactly what I am finding, experiencing anecdotally, and what I write about in the book. I think there is so much intensity to be found with really deep emotional connection. And the research participants I talked to, I talked to people who had been in relationships over 30 years. None of them talked about honeymoon stage sex as being the best. They talked about sex being so intense and so passionate after having some shared life experiences together, after navigating some real challenging times in their life, but their partner showing up for them. I had this one again this one keeps coming to mind, this breast cancer survivor. Their relationship was on the rocks. They were almost going to get a divorce. And then she got breast cancer and they stayed together, but he did not leave her side. And she said, the sex we had as I was on the road to recovery just blew everything else out of the water. And it was because of the attachment they had to one another and the commitment. So I think that's what a lot of people just don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think, with any social movement, it's not uncommon for the pendulum to swing a bit too far in the new direction before eventually balancing out, which I hope it does.
Hope it does. Yeah, it sounds like there's more opinions you're expressing there, but this is the new taboo. The
Yeah,
new
yeah,
having conservative views is the new taboo views, and
yeah,
deep wanting deep
exactly.
romance and connection. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. What surprises you by the sort of questions you get asked? You know, you're promoting the book, you're on TV, you're doing stuff like what are people, what's the general kind of attitude you're hitting? Is it just one of curiosity? People love talking about sex, don't they? I mean, everyone loves a good gossip about it. Are people
Mhm.
looking to be the sort of, the sex master, the orgasm master? Are people just feeling like just a bit sad that they're not getting great sex? Like, how's it
Mhm.
landing with people?
The feedback across the board is that it's refreshing. Because I think it simplifies the path in a way that makes it very attainable for people. It, I think, kind of destigmatizes or decentralizes rather the idea that the answer is to get wild and crazy. It's kind of a back to the basics, and that in and of itself I think is refreshing for people. Just presenting the data that, hey, great sex is something that can be sustained in long-term relationships, not just because I think it can and this is a hypothesis, but this has been studied. Peggy Kleinplatz also really pioneered a lot of the work in optimal sex, and this is, far beyond just quote unquote satisfactory sex or good enough sex. This is people who feel like they are having the best sex of their lives. She didn't even talk to people who were under the age of 65 in her research study. So I think it removes a lot of the myth that sex is only going to be good in the honeymoon stage, and that the answer to maintaining sex for the long haul is non-monogamy, because you got to just keep things new and fresh through new people. And again, while I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and that can work for a lot of people. In fact, one of the couples who I describe in the book talks about kind of opening, they play with the idea of opening their relationship. Um, I don't think it's the end all be all answer. I think that, again, with the right intention and tools, anyone can cultivate this in long-term relationships, even if they're monogamous.
Yeah, yeah. And the issue I've found with open stuff is this sort of depth on the other side of boredom. And if you've always got another option, then why would you go through the hard work of deep communication and vulnerability and reestablishing connection? And, why would you bother with all that when you can just pick up an app and find
Yeah.
a hot person? So, yeah, something
Well,
is lost in that.
yeah, and the whole gamification of dating apps is just burning out a lot of people. There's so much in the media now about people going boy sober or taking on these celibacy eras, and it's like they think the answer to all of this is to stop sex and romance rather than maybe get back to the basics and stop the apps and just get out in the real world and meet people the way we're meant to connect. Like, let's see how that changes your opinion.
I mean, everybody hates the apps. When you talk to people, everybody hates them.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and they're particularly bad for men. Men can't get matches in that sense. There's a sort of economics of it. We've probably looked into it that a small number of men are kind of cleaning up, and it doesn't really, the women are getting laid but not getting relationships, and
Yeah.
most men are not getting either. It's kind of rubbish for everyone. And
Yeah, it
of
really
course,
is.
because it's a business model. So why on earth would they want people to
Yeah, why would they
couple
want
up?
it to work?
Why would they? There's no business case for
Yeah.
it to actually be
Yeah.
coupling
Yeah.
people.
Exactly.
And lots of also we're in the least reproductive time ever in the history of Western culture. So people
Yeah.
aren't we're like pandas at this point.
I know.
We're like over socialized pandas in a zoo
Yeah.
who won't fuck for any reason.
Yeah.
And they say young people are having less sex than ever, which is a tragedy.
Oh,
So
it's horrible. I mean, I was listening to this interview with Bill Maher the other day, and he said this study came out, or a poll, that a lot of college graduates are saying they have PTSD from the college experience, and he's like, they should be coming out with an STD, not PTSD. Like, what the fuck, you know?
a treatable one,
Um,
hopefully.
yeah.
Let's talk about trauma a little bit then. So trauma,
Okay.
I'm teaching on trauma today. I'm doing a summit on it. It's always hot. It's always a big topic. As
Hmm.
I've matured, I've realized so much of my previous attractions were either attachment issues, neurotic attachment issues,
Hmm.
or simply trauma excitement. There's a sort of trauma, there's an element to attraction that's, or we could say Jungian terms, shadow projection, like, oh my God, she's
Yeah.
amazing, Romeo and Juliet, I can
Right.
never be like
Right.
her. And as one matures, the attraction changes because there's hopefully, if you're doing the work, less trauma, less shadow, your
Hmm.
attachment issues are hopefully a little bit healed, so they're not quite so extreme.
Sure.
And I found myself attracted to a very different type of person than I used to, which
Hmm.
I think is
Hmm.
good. It's kind of like,
Yeah.
well, if I've grown, then that's appropriate. So maybe you could say something about the difference between sort of neurotic attraction and a slightly more healed attraction.
So I write about this in the vulnerability and in the adaptability chapters. There's a new area of research looking at post-traumatic growth. For a long time, we were kind of stuck in research around post-traumatic disorder. People go through negative events, and that can be big T trauma, like a soldier coming back from combat, or it can be little T trauma, like, having attachment issues from your family of origin and that manifesting itself in unhealthy relationship patterns. But what I found is that a lot of people who work through that trauma, they're healed. But what we see in post traumatic growth research is that it adds to complexity of the self. So they are different maybe from people who had, let's say, a picture perfect upbringing and secure attachment from day one. There are going to be more complex individuals, but that can add kind of a level of excitement, I think, to relationships that, people who hadn't gone through any kind of trauma or healing work would bring to the table. And what I want people to take away from that is, just because you had trauma in your past doesn't at all mean that you're unworthy of having a meaningful relationship. And yes, there may be elements to yourself, your psyche, your personality that are a bit more complex, but that can kind of add to what you bring into the bedroom rather than deter from it. The other thing,
Non-traumatized people are boring. I agree.
yeah, exactly,
The
exactly.
bland, warm water, non-traumatized people, they got nothing interesting going on.
But
I, I
it's like people who've never gone through anything in life, I do think to an extent can be a bit less interesting.
I mean, I
I'm gonna
literally had
say
this choice
it.
as I was recoupling. Do I want to get together with someone who's had some trauma but dealt with it really well, or someone who's a bit younger who had just didn't have much trauma, as far as I could tell? And
Yeah,
it was very easy and sweet, but there was something missing there. There's a
I
sort of
know.
character, a kind of quality of depth. And also, I think, for anyone who's been fucked up, you're never really totally unfucked. You're just kind of more dealing with it better. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like, how can you really relate and connect with someone who hasn't had that experience, I would say, right? So,
It's hard. Yeah. I remember in college being like, why am I not into these frat guys? Because that's what all my friends were interested in, these frat guys. And I don't know that that's so much of a thing in the UK, but, I'm like, it's because they've all been fed with a silver spoon,
uh-huh,
like
uh-huh.
they were all grew up in these really wealthy families, and who knows what was there below the surface. But as far as I could tell, they just seemed shallow.
Wasn't very colorful.
Yeah.
Let's before we kind of want to wrap up in that 10, but before we do, let's just do the sort of quick fire. If someone says, okay, this is all great, be embodied, I get what you're saying, vulnerability, depth, commitment, it's all good. But give me the quick fire. Like someone just says, I'm listening to this with my husband. We're both, I don't know, 50 years old. We've been married 20 years. We're listening in this in, I don't know, Cologne or Chicago or wherever. And just give us a few things to try out. Give us a few tips or things to try out.
First thing is, ask yourself where you are in your relationship. Do you feel like life has gotten too predictable and monotonous and maybe you need to shake things up? Then take a look at the curiosity section. Do you feel like you are so busy that you are living like two ships passing in the night? See how you can slow down and take a look at the sensuality section. I tell people that this stuff, it's not, I like to think of it more as a menu than a roadmap. And so the answer to that, I think, really depends on what your relationship needs. Do you feel emotionally disconnected, almost like your roommates, and you need to revive the romantic component of your relationship? Take a look at vulnerability. Do you feel like sex has gotten kind of clunky or awkward, and you're longing for that feeling of being in sync with one another? Then take a look at attunement. So I think there's something in there for everyone, but the first thing you have to do is kind of assess what your relationship needs. So I don't know that that answers the question,
No,
but
that's great. That's great. So like I definitely relate to if it's you're just too busy and stressed and it's like making time and space and
yeah.
coming back into your bodies. I know you've got a lot of embodied practices recommended in the book. And
Mm.
I found nature connection to be hugely helpful for that. Like
Oh,
it's amazing like how
huge.
much that helps me get into my sensual body again. And
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
nothing more sexy than nature, right? So it's like it's
right,
another big
right.
one. Yeah.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
What is a question you wish you would get asked about sex? What's the average American talk show host just not going to ask you that you wish they would ask you?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question. What do I wish they would? I mean, I can't say, Mark, that any one specific thing is coming to mind. Because I think the main question I get asked is it possible to sustain passion in long-term relationships? And I think that's what a lot of people want to know. Um, but no, I can't say anything's coming to mind
Okay,
necessarily.
last one. Which celebrity would be improved personality wise if they got laid more, if they had more and better sex? Who needs fucking better as a person? Let's
Oh God.
which who has got a stick in their ass and needs it replaced by something more interesting. So yeah, go for it. Last
Oh
one.
my God. I mean, I do not follow celebrities that much. All I'll say is I can just tell you lately I've had a huge celebrity crush on
Right.
Jake Gyllenhaal. That show he did called Presumed Innocent. I was like, Jake Gyllenhaal is back on my
He's
radar.
back. Okay, he's
Yeah,
your
he was
celebrity crush.
back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
me and the girl,
Yeah.
you're allowed celebrity crushes. That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's totally legit. Good. Okay, Emily, this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. The book Anatomy of Desire, I recommend it. It's an easy read. It's broken down, certainly for embodiment people. There's plenty they'll resonate with in there. And yeah, where do people find you and your work?
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. I'm across all the social media channels at Dr. Emily Jamea. The book is available everywhere books are sold. And I've got tons of free bonuses on my website through my pub date. So if you buy the book and you want more, you can go on there and get all the details and get some fun extras.
Yeah, the website just for the YouTube watcher. The website I really liked because there was just like stuff on there that was really easy to see, and there's kind of like
Mhm.
free stuff and just very clear. I actually like sent it to my. I'm not getting paid commission by the way in any way here. Just,
Yeah.
but I actually sent it to my web designer saying, "Hey, have a
Uh,
look at this. This is really clear, like, and there's
yeah.
free samples and free sexual confidence hypnosis." I was like, "It's a nice
Mhm.
website." So
Yeah.
yeah, I
Thank
want to
you.
recommend that. Emily, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.